now is not the time to look away from Ukraine.
Now, as the war in Ukraine enters its 5th year, President Zelensky says that Vladimir Putin has not achieved his goals. Sir Keir Starmer has pledged UK support for as long as it takes. The PM accused Moscow of blocking the path to peace and said it was losing the war.
In the last year, Russia has suffered 500,000 casualties to gain and occupy less than 1% extra of Ukrainian territory. That is not a country that 4 years into a conflict is winning.
Well, on the ground, the human cost continues to mount and humanitarian needs remain vast. So let's talk about those with Elisabeth Haslund, who is Senior Communications Officer at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine this afternoon. Elisabeth, a very good afternoon from us in London. Just tell us a little bit about the mood there today, what people have talked about today, the feelings and the emotions in Kyiv.
Well, I think one of my Ukrainian colleagues said it very clear when she said it feels like that first night of the Russian invasion now 4 years ago has never ended. And that is really the reality here on the ground in Ukraine, that the war is just grinding on relentlessly with continued attacks. Last year, 2025, was actually the most deadly year for civilians since the start of the full-scale invasion. It was 4 days only during the entire year that there were no attacks, so 361 days with attacks on Ukraine. So it really shows that intensification of the war and the level of attacks that we've witnessed in the last couple of months, and that is continuing now in 2026. And of course, it's affecting everyone in Ukraine. So it is what I hear from my colleagues, the people I meet here. You know, they are tired and they are exhausted after 4 years of this war.
And Elisabeth, what does living with that level of trauma for years do to a person?
Well, I mean, it is heartbreaking and harrowing stories I hear also when I travel around the country. One thing I think maybe it's not reported on so much is that even though we don't see big numbers of refugees leaving Ukraine, those big numbers were back in 2022, there are still people who are fleeing every single day from the frontline regions now. And I mean, the stories I hear when I've been to some of these transit centers that are being set up to receive people and where we are supporting from UNHCR side, you know, they're telling the stories about how their villages have become ghost towns. There were no neighbors left. There were no water, no electricity, no heating. There was no way where to buy bread anymore. So, you know, it's heartbreaking stories. We hear it also from the people who are living in the bigger cities where there is this constant threat of attacks. When will the next missile or drone hit? Will it be my building? So that constant insecurity about the future, I think, is really something that is characterizing the situation here in Ukraine and is, of course, affecting the mental health of people here.
The statements that are made by many world leaders, by our own Prime Minister in this country, they remain quite strong, they remain quite fierce. But the truth of the matter is they don't touch the sides with the man who really needs to be listening, who is Vladimir Putin. And I wonder what you can tell us about how Ukrainians that you spend time with think now about that kind of political leadership from the West.
Well, it's you know, as a humanitarian agency, it's not really my role to go too much into the politics. What I can say is that, you know, what I hear from the people is that they need peace and they hope for peace, and I think we can agree they need a just and a lasting peace, and I think what is also important is to note that, you know, the humanitarian situation, we need to remember that when there are all these news and negotiations on the peace and on these diplomatic talks, the reality on the ground here is that the humanitarian needs are immense. It's more than 10 million people across Ukraine who are in need of humanitarian aid. And these needs will actually also persist should we have a peace agreement tomorrow, because the needs are so big, there are so many people displaced. 3 million homes have been destroyed since the start of the full-scale invasion, so the recovery will not happen overnight. So I think another, let's say, concern for us is, of course, the sustained international support for that humanitarian and recovery work. You know, the British public, the British government, companies and other donors, they have supported generously, but we are seeing globally that the support for humanitarian work across the world is diminishing, and that is of course also affecting our work here in Ukraine. So we do need that sustained support and solidarity. Now is not the time to look away from Ukraine.
Yeah, and our foreign aid budget is down, isn't it, as are some of our kind of contemporary countries and allies. Can I ask you, is there a conversation about rebuilding that is constantly going on, with the notion that were peace to be achieved, a process could then immediately begin?
You know, I would actually say that some of the recovery and the rebuilding have started already. And I get this question quite a lot. People are saying, you are telling us the attacks are continuing. How can you also tell us about the recovery? How does that match up? And the fact is that people's lives don't stop. People cannot put their lives and the society on pause. So even if those attacks continue every single day, people are displaced every single day, there is an eagerness amongst the Ukrainian public, the government and authorities, and also local communities here to start that recovery process. So it's actually one part of the work we are doing, and others, of course, also here in Ukraine, already starting that recovery work. So, for example, we are helping to repair homes that have been damaged in the war. We've repaired 55,000 so far. And that, of course, helps the people who are here in Ukraine, who want to somehow continue their lives, even if the war continues. But this is also what will help pave the way for larger returns of refugees once the security situation will allow it.
Of course, living away from Ukraine presents its own problems, and so many of those people who left after the full-scale invasion couldn't possibly have imagined that they would still be at a point of refuge in this country or other countries, 4 years on. Do you know very much about how those communities have fared and are faring?
I mean, I'm not an expert on, for example, the Ukrainian refugees right now in the UK, for example, but we do in UNHCR do regular surveys amongst the Ukrainian refugees to check in on what is their situation and also what are their intentions for return. And that's also why we know that it is still the majority of Ukrainian refugees who want to return once it's safe enough to do so. And it's also from those surveys we know that of course it's the security that plays a major role, but also factors like, will I have a roof over my head? Will I be able to get a job so I can provide for my family? Will there be basic services in place, schools for my children, so on? These are also things that will help people decide on their considerations for return. But one thing we can see, and that is one of the, let's say, more unfortunate learnings from these surveys and from some of our monitoring of people who are returning to Ukraine, because some people have returned to Ukraine, is we can also see some do that because they say that they don't have full access to healthcare in the countries where they have sought safety. So that, of course, speaks to the situation and the inclusion that, of course, needs to be in place for Ukrainian refugees who have left the country and sought safety elsewhere.
An interesting question from one of our listeners, Elisabeth. Our listener is Karen. She says, I was sending money regularly to Ukraine for humanitarian aid, but I got nervous with all of the talk of corruption. Now, Karen has asked, could you advise a safe place to send money? I'm not sure that it would be appropriate for me to ask you to do that, but I wonder about the wider point on corruption and whether you believe that that has hampered your work.
It's a good question, and of course we also followed here very intensely those reports and the unfolding of corruption allegations. I can say very clearly, because I see it myself when I'm traveling around the country, I do see the results of our work. We are working very closely with Ukrainian NGOs here on the ground who are there in the front lines. They respond 30, 40 minutes after attacks to help the people who are affected by the aerial strikes. We also provide what we call cash assistance, but it's actually quite it's not cash we give in the hand here, it's being delivered to people's accounts. This is support, vital support, going straight to people's accounts. So, no strange ways for that. So we do see that the aid is reaching the people who need it the most. But there is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we see is really that the needs are so big, and even with the support we get to help us do our work, we simply cannot reach everybody in need, which is why we have to make the very difficult priorities sometimes on who to direct the aid to, because we can only reach that many people with what we have the funding for.